The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. Today, we are very excited to have a guest, Dr. Nicole Bedera, and she has become somewhat of a go-to expert for understanding power and sexual violence in pop culture. She's weighed in on a number of high-profile cases, specifically one we've covered, which is Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp. And she also has a book coming out. By the time this episode airs, that book will likely be out already. But we have Nicole here. Nicole, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I got into this work about 10 years ago, originally as a victim advocate. And working within the criminal justice system, I was working as a hospital advocate. So one of the people who would be there during a forensic exam, you might know as a rape kit. And in that role, survivors were asking me a lot of questions that there weren't great answers for. Things like, why did this happen to me? Why does this keep happening to so many people? If all of our stories are so similar, why is no one doing anything about this? And when I turned to the academic research, I was not impressed by what I found. And so I got a PhD to try to do some better research. And so I finished my PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan a couple of years ago. That work turned into the book that is now out called On the Wrong Side, about sexual violence in universities and really why it is the same every year. One of the things that I find the most just vexing about the problem of sexual violence is that the rates are so consistent. If it was a bunch of unpredictable individual people all acting unpredictably and individually, we would see the rates fluctuate a lot. And instead, we see that the rates of sexual violence on college campuses have been identical since we first started measuring them 60 years ago. They haven't changed at all. And so that's where my research comes at it. What are the social structures? Why is it so predictable? And what can we do to finally fix this?
I'm currently in grad school for social work, and you've said a lot of key terms that we are learning in class every single day. And it seems like you're coming at things from, as you said, kind of a social level, social science, looking at the community, the structure. How is the community formed? How do we change the inner workings of a university structure or just a cultural structure in general? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I'm really interested in. One of the things that, again, is really vexing about sexual violence is that all of the solutions that we turn to don't seem to be doing anything. That you can sit through all the trainings in the world and all of the online modules teaching you what sexual harassment is, and it's not fixing anything. And so the part I'm interested in is, what if the problem is the structure itself? And what if the problem is all of these things that we would never think to change because it's just the way things are, these deeply entrenched traditions that create power imbalances, inequality, and all of these other things that create vulnerabilities for victimization and really make perpetrators above reproach. That's really what a lot of my work turned into, is this question of when someone is behaving badly, when they're acting violently, why is everyone rallying around them when instead we should be removing them from the community that they pose a threat to? That, I think, is the real core of it. Why are these people protected, and what is their role within the structure? How can we change that?
We've talked about this on previous episodes, and something we kind of bring up a lot when people are like, oh, have you heard about this person? Why aren't you talking about this person or that person? We're not trying to change like one or two people. It's like, this is a culture shift that we're looking to be a part of. This whole rape culture thing where, it could be an offhand joke that on the surface may seem harmless, but like you said, just sort of like protects people, and it's the way it's always been. So it's just how it is. Part of the reason why all these numbers are the same, because the culture is not changing.
Right. And I think the individual approach is actually a pretty difficult approach to win on. So when we talk about this being a structural problem or a cultural problem, a lot of the time people say, that's so overwhelming. How can we change things on that big of a scale? And I feel the opposite. I feel like if we're trying to convince individual perpetrators to change their behavior, we will never be done. There will always be a new one. It's a game of whack-a-mole. But if we can change social structures, to make it so that there aren't so many advantages given to perpetrators. That's one of the things I find in my work, is that perpetrators get tangible benefits from acting violently. And a lot of them, especially on college campuses, they will commit acts of sexual violence while they're on campus, and then once they graduate, they won't. And I think one of the clearest examples of this that everybody's kind of heard of is Brett Kavanaugh, that as far as we know, his most sexually violent years happened while he was in school, and then he left, and the incentive structure changed. He's no longer trying to fit in with young men trying to prove that they're men through these masculinity contests that turn violent, that objectify women. And instead, we don't know what else might have been going on in his life. I'm not going to, say that without a doubt he hasn't done anything violent. But I would say that's a really sort of typical trajectory of a lot of perpetrators of sexual violence, is that a lot of them are not so much motivated to be violent because there's something wrong with them or they're narcissists or sociopaths or whatever else it is that people think. A lot of them are just men trying to fit in, especially men who feel insecure in their masculinity. And so if we can change the structural incentives to say this is not how you become more secure in your identity, let's find healthier ways to be more secure in your identity. And instead of getting all those benefits we're looking for, you're going to find some consequences instead. I think that can be really powerful. And so I actually think the structural approach is really optimistic. It's way easier than looking at the same individual cases over and over and over and wondering why we can't stop it.
I've had so many light bulb above my head moments in the last 45 seconds. It's absolutely crazy. Just the idea of you kind of flipping the norm, what people on our side of the debate consistently talk about. How do we get to these people? How do we change this culture? What do we do? And you saying the individual is actually more challenging than the social aspect is the antithesis of what everyone talks about. And it's so interesting because when you say it and you break it down the way you did, it makes so much sense. I mean, they're being able to hide in cultural norms. And if you change those cultural norms or you remove those norms completely, then there's no place for them to hide. And then they don't need to go through the hoop jumping of the cultural norm. They don't need to go through the masculinity tests of this specific way that ends up endangering women, proving something supposedly. Then everything just kind of changes and some of this behavior is negated.
Yeah, and I think it's true. I think it is true that it's easier to change the system, especially because then we're not trying to convince overwhelmingly men to care about overwhelmingly women and other gender marginalized people to say, can you please give us our rights? Can you please just make up your mind to give up male privilege? Are you sure that you don't want that? Of course there are men that are going to be resistant to that, right? And so one of the things I think is more optimistic about it is, first of all, I think it's more accurate that we're more likely to be able to save ourselves, so to speak, and to organize for each other than we are to get it the other way around. But also, it does mean that some of the most difficult people who've stood in the way of this progress, who say, I'm going to be the one to stop it, we don't really need them. There are a lot of other ways to produce that cultural shift without going to the most violent, the most misogynistic people and just saying, begging them to change their minds. They're not going to. And so they've been able to stop progress because we keep going to them and asking them to change, and they don't want to.
One of the things that you talk about is supporting survivors. And what we talk about is mostly about music. And when you've been assaulted or abused or harassed by a public figure, there's sort of a backlash that doesn't exist when it's just a private citizen. Because they have this
massive fan base.
Yeah,
right?
They have this whole fan base behind them that is also kind of coming at you. Can you talk a little bit about survivor support when it comes to aspects like that?
Yeah, there are a few things I want to talk about. One is why this happens. And this brings me to something I say all the time, to the point that my students say I could call my class this phrase because I say it so often. But one of the things that I say is that we are all on board with supporting a survivor until the perpetrator is someone we know and love. And we do all know and love perpetrators, which is unsettling to us. And there are a couple of ways to make sense of this. But one of the ones that's really grounded in the research is that when the perpetrator is someone who we trust, who we enjoy, who we want to spend time around, or we want to engage in a fandom around them, they mean so much to us on a personal level, it makes us feel really unsafe. To say, I let this person in to the most personal parts of who I am, and apparently they're not trustworthy. And so a lot of people just reject that knowledge. And there's this idea that if you can find a reason that the victim is at fault, that creates justice in the world. It's something called the just world hypothesis. And when people feel threatened and they say, wow, I'm really scared something scary could happen to me, apparently, I didn't have the intuition I thought I did, which none of us do. Perpetrators don't look the way we've been taught they look or act. And so when we're in that situation where we feel like, wow, I feel kind of unsafe and unsettled, we want to restore this sense that there is a just world, that violence doesn't happen to people who don't deserve it. And that's where the victim blaming comes in. That's why people fall short of survivors a lot of the time. And so some of it is a stan culture and putting artists, men in particular, on this pedestal. But we see it in other places too. I can think of some scandals involving women that have gone the same way, right? And some of it is that desire to sort of rally around them because of male privilege. But a lot of it is really something a bit more psychologically difficult than that. And so a big part of being able to see through it and to be able to move through it is to sit with that discomfort, is to recognize, violence, it can happen to anyone. But also from a sociological perspective, I would say it's not totally random either. It's not totally random either. It follows all these predictable norms. And hopefully that can offer a little bit of solace. But the other thing I'll say is just we have to resist the temptation to have that sort of selfish, knee-jerk reaction of, I want to feel safe. It's not making you safer. In fact, it's making you less safe to do this, right? It's making our society less safe when we do this. But to say, I'm not going to give myself the comfort of feeling safe in an unsafe world. And instead to really focus on what it is the survivor is asking for, which is something else that I think leads to a lot of hostility towards survivors. One of the striking things in my research on this book was I would ask survivors, why did you come to your university for help? Why did you decide to report what happened to you in whatever form you did? And most of the time, they were looking for the violence to stop. They didn't really care very much what happened to their perpetrator, or they didn't have the kind of views that people thought they did. They weren't out here, trying to ruin lives. I talk a lot about the myth of ruining a man's life in this book. I think that's probably what I'm most known for, is being someone who really talks about this myth of ruined lives. But they were really just looking for safety and to protect other people. That was another big motivator. Another reason people came forward a lot is because their traumatic symptoms from what happened were starting to interfere with the rest of their life. And then in this society, we don't really have a framework to give survivors that. People immediately rush to, well, what do we do about the perpetrator? We're really perpetrator-centered. So when survivors say, here are my tangible needs that need to be met, people say, well, just report it, go to the police, go to the press, you need to warn other people, which is also kind of that, like this other side of the coin of that same sort of selfish reaction of, you have to make the world safe for me. You have to take on all the risks and make the world safe from you. So you have to come forward. And so they're kind of, survivors get it from both sides, right? A lot of the time, that knee-jerk reaction of I'm going to, swarm around the perpetrator and protect the perpetrator is because we're not listening to what survivors are really looking for, and we put them into these narratives that don't match what they want. That being said, I do think most survivors want consequences for their perpetrator. I do think most people, when they think about sexual violence not involving one of their faves, that's something that they feel strongly about too, that there should be consequences for committing acts of sexual violence. But one of the pieces of advice I would give to anybody is if a survivor discloses to you or a survivor says something, they come forward publicly about someone who you're a big fan of, let's try to figure out what they specifically want and need in this moment. And that can actually be a way to channel some of that anxiety that we feel instead of feeling like, oh, this is so hopeless, there's nothing for me to do. Well, if the survivor's looking for something specific, you can be a part of that solution. If one of the things they want is for everybody who reads the story to turn to someone they know and have a conversation about it, to raise some awareness, to share information, to protect others, that's something you can do to be supportive. And, there's this brilliant, really famous trauma researcher named Judith Herman, who one of the things that she says a lot in her work is that one of the reasons we side with victims is because victims are asking us to do something hard. They're asking us to hold someone accountable. They're asking us for support. Whereas perpetrators are asking us to do something easy. And I think that's especially true in a fan culture. All they're really asking you to do is keep listening to their music, to keep promoting their music. It's something you've already done, you're already familiar with. And I would say that we need to do the hard thing because it's the right thing.
You were talking about the easiness of what the musician or the artist is asking for. Just keep doing what you're doing. Enjoy my music. Listen to it. Don't stop. That's very, very simple. For us, we cover a lot of like rock, punk music, alternative, all of that. There is a now pretty well-known situation with a band called Brand New. And you listen to some of these lyrics,
they're very off-putting. It's almost fortuitous what you find out later after you've been absorbing and memorizing this album. And I've actually seen people in comments say things like, I don't care what people think he did. He's hot, and I let him do those things to me. As someone who has experienced some of these things, that is such a vile, horrible thing to just kind of throw out into the universe. Tell me more about this on a PhD level. Who are these people and what are they talking about and why?
I actually wrote an essay about this very phenomenon in the Johnny Depp case that I'll send to you, and you can link it in the show notes. But it was all about, anybody who spoke out about the Johnny Depp case, especially someone who's a sexual violence expert, which I am, and I did speak about it. We got bombarded with emails from people who identified as survivors and said they were throwing their support behind Johnny Depp, and they were looking for people like me to do the same. And it came from a bunch of different perspectives. But one of the main things that came out of this was really this criticism of Amber Heard, was really saying she's giving survivors a bad name. She's not the right kind of survivor. I never would have handled it this way. And yes, I would, be very open to having this kind of a relationship with Johnny Depp and kind of a sense of like, isn't she lucky? And what I wrote in the essay is a couple of things. Part of this is something that sometimes survivors will do when they have some unresolved trauma. It's a way of distancing yourself. And it actually comes up in the literature around the frequency of sex following a sexual assault. So a lot of people would expect that after you've been sexually assaulted, you would maybe not want to have sex again, be triggered by sex. And that's sort of the reaction we can all wrap our heads around. And that is a common reaction. But another common reaction is to have a lot more sex. And it comes from the same type of thinking. It comes from the thinking of, if I just consent to everything, I can never be violated again. And it'll be empowering and it will heal me. And I just need to give these men more of what they want. What we find, though, is that victims that use that coping mechanism tend to be sexually assaulted again, because ultimately you can tell yourself you're consenting to everything, but you're not. There's some stuff that is beyond your boundaries. And so a lot of survivors sort of go through this period of experimenting with things this way. And I think it's totally reasonable, especially in a patriarchal system. And you're being told if you'd just been okay with it, it would have been fine. Other people are okay with it. Why aren't you okay with it? That's how self-blame gets inside of us. It leads us to try to change our own behavior when the problem isn't you. And that's part of what I hear in those comments is people who are trying to distance themselves from maybe their own experiences and saying, actually, I'm kind of down for everything now. So there's no such thing as sexual violence, which is something that they've internalized after people have said it to them. And so again, the culprit is the culture and the individual sort of stuck here. That being said, we still have responsibility to show up for other survivors and to not propagate rape culture. It doesn't make it okay just because you've been sexually assaulted that now you've joined the other side. And I want to say too, it won't make you safer either. That's kind of a consistent theme here. But the other thing I wrote about is, again, that just world hypothesis that we talked about, that this idea of blaming the victim, of saying, she just was too prude, she wasn't open-minded enough, doesn't she realize she's so lucky, or she must have actually liked it, and she's just trying to ruin his life, she's opportunistic, she's trying to get rich off of this, which, by the way, that does not happen. But that's part of that just world hypothesis, again, of trying to find something that's wrong with the victim as part of saying it won't happen to me. This kind of behavior is particularly common among survivors that hold privileged identities. For example, conservative white women were some of the people who said this kind of stuff the most often in my research, because there was a sense of, if I punched down to other survivors, I did everything right. People will then give me support as being the best survivor, and they had this hierarchy in their mind. But again, that's just what people were telling them as part of the rape culture they were intersecting with when they disclosed that they'd been sexually assaulted. They were being told, if you just done X, Y, and Z right, or of course I would believe you, but it's these other people that made me doubt you at first because they give survivors a bad name. And so survivors are sort of internalizing these messages and then putting them back out onto other survivors. And that's actually, when we talk about things that we can do that goes beyond just trying to change the hearts and minds of individual perpetrators, this is one of them, is to help survivors get access to supportive messaging instead of self-blame, so that that self-blame doesn't get externalized onto other survivors. Conversations like this one can go a long way in helping people say, actually, that wasn't my fault at all. And I'm not going to hold other survivors to that standard either.
And mentioning other survivors coming in support of like a Johnny Depp or someone like that, and saying things like, well, I'm a survivor. I didn't react that way, as if every person's trauma response is exactly the same, which we know is absolutely not the case.
Right. That's another big issue too, is that survivors are not experts on sexual violence. If anything, the people who are most likely to be targeted would be people who are a little bit not experts, if you know what I mean. That if you are a clear expert on sexual violence, violence can still happen to you, but it's harder to perpetrate, right? And so perpetrators, there's a reason that they really focus on, for example, younger women or children who wouldn't have access to sex education in our country, who wouldn't know what healthy boundaries look like, because it's easier to perpetrate when the victim is only realizing that something is violent when it's too late to resist. Victims are pretty good at resisting, but only if they can resist at a certain point before things, reach this point of no return. And so what ends up happening is a lot of survivors really only have their own experience to go off of. And they can look at other survivors with some skepticism of saying, well, that's not how I would handle it. Is that going to get, am I going to face judgment? Am I going to face stigma? I don't condone that. I don't think that's sexual assault. And that's something where, again, more education about what sexual violence is, what consent is, can go a really long way. I'm not convinced that these programs work super great for convincing perpetrators not to perpetrate, because they don't do it on accident. They know what they're doing. But they can go a long way in helping survivors be able to support each other, helping people who have no experience with sexual violence be able to recognize sexual violence for what it is, and then know what's a better, healthier way to respond.
Why do you think our country is so scared to talk about this? I mean, we're scared to talk about sex too, especially in any sort of educational type system. But while I feel like the waves are kind of crashing on the shore, there's waves of change happening. It just seems like this is such a clandestine topic that it's just remains so out of view. And when you try to discuss it, it becomes either something that people get visibly uncomfortable with, where they try to detach from the situation, or they kind of brush off the conversation completely. So we never really get anywhere with it.
Yeah. One of the first things I write in the book is that one of the reasons that we can sort of look away from the campus sexual violence crisis is paradoxically because it's so severe. People get uncomfortable because they have personal experiences with this violence. And we think of that a lot from the perspective of survivors of, oh, this might be triggering, this might be upsetting to talk about. But it's also true that there are a lot of perpetrators around. And a lot of the reasons why these conversations derail is because there's actually a perpetrator present. Some of the things that have been most shocking to me in my career, there are two moments that come to mind, one from the book and one from when I was very, very early doing my first research project as an undergrad. And as an undergrad, I conducted a climate survey at my university, my little liberal arts college, because they'd never done one. They didn't know how much sexual violence was happening. They assumed that because there was no Greek system and there weren't really a lot of athletics, that there was no sexual assault. The students obviously knew that to not be true. And so for my senior thesis, I conducted the school's first climate survey. And immediately when I started sharing the findings, my friends started disclosing to me about sexual assault experiences they'd had. And unsurprisingly from a researcher perspective, but as an undergrad, I was so surprised. I identified 3 serial perpetrators. I was friends with 2 of them and friendly with the 3rd. Because of course that's how it works. Sexual violence, the perpetration is close to home. If you know the victim, you very often know the perpetrator too. And so if you think about trying to have a conversation about sexual violence within your own friend group, for example, that's a really hard thing to do if the victim and perpetrator are both present and feeling forced by our social norms to share space. That the victim can't speak openly about their experience because it's literally unsafe, and the perpetrator is going to try to derail the conversation. And the other thing that this makes me think of when I was working on the book is just how many of the people in positions of power at universities that either, the place where I did the research or the universities I was attending at the time were perpetrators of violence themselves. I went to the University of Maryland for my master's degree and the University of Michigan for my PhD. Both of the presidents that were in their presidential position while I was a student at those 2 schools were removed for sexual misconduct. And so when you think about who's shaping these structures, who's shaping these policies, and why it's so difficult to make some progress, one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit that we don't want to grapple with is how perpetrators actually are in positions of power. I was speaking to a reporter once who said, how is it that the men's rights movement has infiltrated politics so much more effectively than the feminist movement in a lot of ways? And I said, well, there have been some big exposés on some political figures who are lurking on those Reddit threads. They're the same people. And I think it makes us feel kind of crazy to acknowledge that. It feels like it's some kind of a conspiracy theory. But it's also just the way it is. 2 out of our 7 Supreme Court justices have committed acts of sexual violence. That's just the way it is. And especially in a society where one of the things I talk about in the book is there was this idea that when the Title IX office, which is the office that handles sexual assault complaints on a college campus, but when the Title IX office was thinking about these cases, they really shouldn't hire investigators who are survivors because they would be biased and they would take the survivor's side. And so they had all of these different ways that they would ask questions during interviews to try to figure out if someone was a survivor or if they were really close to a survivor, and that would be disqualifying. And survivors don't hide that. Survivors, if that's why they want to work in one of these offices is to change the system from the inside, they tend to be pretty honest about it. In comparison, the university that I spent my time at, none of the questions that they had for potential new hires were about, have you perpetrated a sexual assault? And I think we'd expect a perpetrator to hide that information. But the reality is across a lot of these industries, and I'm not thinking about colleges, now I'm thinking of work I've done at nonprofits, and different types of workplaces. Often if you find out information that someone has perpetrated sexual violence or harassment, and you go to the hiring committee and you say, I don't think we should hire this someone, they'll often say that's a conflict of interest, that's a bias. They'll remove you from the committee and they will not accept the information. So that's sort of the framework we're operating in, is that we're surrounded by, yes, victims all the time, but perpetrators too. And that's why these conversations are so uncomfortable.
In my head, I'm just like, that is fucking crazy that
I know.
happens. That's a conflict of interest. We're just going to remove you. Not the person who perpetrated. We're going to remove you. That is fucking bonkers.
That's what the research finds. There have been researchers that have done something called audit studies. In an audit study, what they do, they're usually around things like hiring and job applications. And so in this one hiring study, this audit study, they put together applications for a hypothetical job, and they're identical. And each research participant only interacts with one of them. The only thing that's different is the name, which they tend to change for whatever demographic they're interested in. In this case, it was gender. And then they included a little vignette about their involvement in a sexual harassment case at their last job. In one case, the potential hire was somebody who had been accused of sexual harassment. And in the other case, they were the whistleblower who had come forward about sexual harassment that they knew about. In the study, they found that the average person would rather hire the accused, and that they would offer the accused more money because the whistleblower was seen as someone who'd be disruptive to the culture, hard to work with, wouldn't look the other way if you made a mistake.
Liability.
We're all a little bit too, this is one of the things I talk about a lot in the book, but we're too empathetic with perpetrators. There's this concept called himpathy, which was coined by the philosopher Kate Mann, which is when we give excessive empathy to men at the expense of women. And we do that a lot with perpetrators. People spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, it would be so hard for me if everything I've worked for in my life was stripped away. And that's what we picture. In the book, I call them fantasies, accumulating fantasies of disaster, I think, which is when we picture anything, any possible negative consequence, we apply it to all sexual violence perpetrators, whether or not it's appropriate. In one of the cases in the book, the perpetrator was the CEO of a company off campus, and the Title IX office talked about, well, if we investigate him, he could lose his job. And we're thinking, how? He's the CEO. Who's firing him? He's not on campus. Any investigation on campus would be in confidential files that the university cannot share outside of their walls. There's no way anybody's finding out about this. This is so ridiculous. But we all kind of go to that space and we empathize with the perpetrators so much that I was really stunned in my research by how everybody sort of had thought, the administrators in particular had thought, well, everybody's going to side with the victim. And that means the perpetrator's at a disadvantage. They deserve someone in their corner. So I'm going to give them that support. But everybody was thinking that way. And so in a lot of the cases, the perpetrator had a huge amount of support from inside the system, and the victim ended up with none, or none that was particularly powerful, that the person who was there for them was someone who couldn't influence the outcome, who wouldn't be able to really take their side in a meaningful way. So yeah, the perpetrators are kind of everywhere. And the other example I was wanting to bring up is families are a good example too. Families are a really common site for violence. And that's one of the main reasons that there's so much resistance to comprehensive sex education. We don't think about it very much in the US. We don't like to talk about it much in the US. But for children, the person who is at greatest risk of sexually assaulting them is their father. And so how do you talk about it around the dinner table? How can we trust that without sex education, that kids who are being abused at home are going to get the kind of education that they need about sexuality, about consent? And that's why it's so important we bring it into the parts of society that we can influence.
We're in a situation nationally right now where we're getting books stripped from our schools. It's hard to pry guns out of people, automatic rifles, not just guns, but automatic rifles from people's hands. How do you think we can move this agenda through the country to ultimately increase our safety overall, to have these conversations about, sexual education, sexual violence, familial violence, if we can't even talk about things like race without people having a conniption fit?
Yeah, it's a tough question, especially on the national level. I will say that one of the things that gives me personally a lot of hope is state legislatures are doing some incredibly common sense and creative things. I testified on the behalf of a bill in the state of California that recognized that one of the big issues with a lot of these industries is we allow for sort of self-regulation and sort of self-governance around issues of discrimination. The anti-discrimination apparatus we've created in the United States is essentially, we trust your workplace to not discriminate. They'll have an HR. Hopefully HR does their job. And if they don't, there's very little recourse. You can potentially escalate it to the EEOC or something like that, but that takes a lot of time and resources that a lot of people just practically don't have. And so these conflicts of interest are one of the things that I really drilled down on in the book. And I want to give you like a little piece of hope about why that is too. So one of the things that's stunning in the book is almost all of the cases that were investigated by the university ended in insufficient evidence, which is the term used on college campuses to basically say not guilty. It's the same equivalent. So the school goes through this often years-long process of investigating a sexual assault or intimate partner violence. Survivors often have to leave school during that time because the violence is so severe and it's escalating during the investigation. And then when all is said and done, it was nothing. Nothing happened. And that's a really depressing finding, that the institution is protecting the perpetrators so predictably. The average university expels one perpetrator every 3 years for sexual assault. We're having this whole discussion right now about due process for perpetrators and has the pendulum swung too far? And the number is 1 in 3, and it's actually probably lower because it has dropped since the Obama era guidance was rescinded. So since Trump took office, a lot of universities aren't investigating sexual assault at all anymore. That being said, the one glimmer, I said I'd give you a glimmer of hope, and I told you something really depressing, but there is a glimmer of hope.
Please.
So the glimmer of hope is that there was a hearing board. If a survivor or a perpetrator wanted to appeal the finding of their case, which perpetrators appealed them all the time, if they had any kind of unfavorable findings. So even if they were found responsible, but it was after they graduated, they would still, for whatever reason, appeal, even though it had no effect on them. And when they appealed their cases, it would go to a voluntary hearing board. So it was made up of volunteers. The hearing board members complained a lot that they didn't receive any training. They felt like they had no idea what they were doing. But in comparison to the school's training, which was all about protecting the institution, they came out on the right side of every single case. In every single case, they recognized the sexual violence for what it was. They recommended an appropriate set of consequences, usually the removal of the perpetrator from the school, which I want to say is the appropriate consequence. The only stake that's there is they have to go to a different school. That seems like a really reasonable consequence to me. If anything, it's lenient. And yeah, the hearing board members, sort of the average person, when they look at these cases, and if they don't have any personal ties to any of the people involved, we can actually understand sexual violence pretty clearly. It's only when we have these other loyalties or people we want to protect or institutions we want to protect that it gets messed up. And so to get back to my original point, the state of California recognized this disparity and said they didn't do it in investigations yet. I hope they do. I hope other states follow suit. But what they did is they said, we actually need there to be an independent office that can support survivors. And so they took, a lot of schools have something called a victim advocacy office, where there's a confidential person who can answer survivors' questions about the reporting process, about what would happen if you went to the police, about any healing resources that might be available, any academic accommodations. And what the state of California said, it was, we actually also want our victim advocates to be able to do things like help a survivor file a lawsuit against their university if their rights were violated, which is something that if they were university employees, they would obviously be fired for. And it's only been a few years, but the results so far have been pretty amazing. Things like now there's a statewide standard in the state of California about what kind of resources should be available in a victim advocacy office. That was one of the big things that schools would do to take the teeth out of these offices, is they just wouldn't fund them. And so that everybody would be overworked. They'd have no time. They wouldn't be able to support people in the way they need to. And so the state of California has said, okay, we're going to have like our plan for what there needs to be for the however many students there need to be, this many advocates. These are the type of programs we're going to do. Same thing with a lot of schools and a lot of workplaces and a lot of industries. When they're in the middle of a sexual violence scandal, they'll pick actions to look like they're taking it seriously that are symbolic. This is something sociologists call symbolic compliance. And it means looking like you did something about civil rights law without doing anything that would change absolutely anything. And so schools tend to do this in the form of prevention materials. The prevention materials that universities use and your workplace, all these sexual harassment seminars you sit through, they're actually known to not just be ineffective, but to increase rates of sexual violence. And so one of the things that they can do when you have these independent victim advocates is say, we're actually not going to put a bunch of resources into prevention programs that don't work. We're going to save those resources for things that can really make a change. And so much of this around sexual violence really is about not spinning our wheels in the wrong direction, harnessing the energy and resources that people have to do something that will actually work and actually be useful. And so that independence is a big piece of it. One of the things I'd like to see, and it's kind of a lofty goal, but I think we can eventually get there, is for all of these cases to be managed independently. Of course, if the only people who have to decide whether or not to drop an artist who's a perpetrator of sexual violence, if it's the record label trying to decide, well, I mean, he brings in a lot of money, he's really popular, and actually he's getting a lot of press right now, and there are suddenly new fans that are really drawn to the violence and that they like him more than ever, we can't be surprised when the industry makes the wrong decision, because they're not invested in ending gender-based violence. That's not what they're there to do. And again, the average person in the US doesn't know that much about gender-based violence. A lot of people, they overestimate the occurrence of false allegations by a lot, by like over 40%. And they tend to think that the victim needed to do something differently, or that sexual violence is because of the behavior of the victim. And so when those are the people who are making these decisions, people who don't know enough, don't have a deep commitment to gender-based violence, but do have other institutional objectives they want to protect, it's not really surprising it turns out this way.
Talking about the, HR department, there's no HR department in a lot of the arts community. If you either victimize someone or you're perpetrated against, what do you do then? There's no one to go to.
Hoping that there will be some independent entity that not only looks into these cases and holds perpetrators accountable for their behavior, but also supports survivors in a real way, which investigations, we're not even thinking about that right now. Survivors are treated like evidence in a large part because places like the Title IX office and HR are mirroring the criminal justice system, where, a lot of people think that prosecutors act on the behalf of victims. They do not. Victims are evidence in these cases. The prosecutors are acting on the behalf of the state. And when you put this same kind of framework into a university setting or a workplace setting, HR is working on the behalf of your workplace. Title IX is working on the behalf of the university. The victims are just evidence, right? And so one of the things we have to do is make sure we're supporting victims. But I do want to talk about what this looks like now when we have to look about this ourselves. And it's kind of funny because through these conversations, I actually realized I'm going to write another book on just this topic because I think it's so important. And the working title so far is I want to think about it from this perspective of the responsibilities of rapists. And one of the things I talk about in this book is this distinction between punishment and consequences, which is an abolitionist principle. So punishment is causing cruelty to someone for the sake of being cruel. And maybe you think it might change their behavior or teach them a lesson, but the cruelty is the point. Consequences are just the naturally occurring things that happen after, for example, in this case, an act of violence. And it can be a little bit easier to wrap your head around in a different situation, right? So if somebody is speeding, they're way over the speed limit and they wreck their car, your car being wrecked is not a punishment. It is the natural consequence of driving recklessly, right? And sometimes these things are accidents and it feels unfair. And sometimes there's a behavior modification that we can learn from, right? But when it comes to sexual violence, there are a lot of naturally occurring consequences. Everybody knows sexual assault is wrong, but a lot of people don't know why. And it's things like, you might be familiar with survivors having psychological outcomes like increased rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, which we usually talk about for perpetrators. There's actually no study that finds that perpetrators have a higher rate of suicidal ideation when they're held accountable. That's just something we all repeat, and we don't know if it's true. But we do know it's true for victims who come forward. They have higher rates of suicidal ideation because of the way that they're objectified and dehumanized as evidence. We also know that survivors experience a lot of things like chronic health issues, chronic migraines, back pain, heart attacks and cancer are all higher in survivors in comparison to women who haven't experienced any kind of violence. And these studies are mostly on women. In the college setting, sexual violence is the best predictor of a college woman's GPA. It is one of the best predictors of whether or not a woman will complete her college education. And it is a very good predictor of whether or not a woman can stay in a male-dominated discipline. Women who seek out to complete a degree in a STEM field often can't because of the trauma that they're experiencing, which once their grades start to slip, trauma can affect things like memory formation, sleep, your ability to pay attention in class. And so if you're dealing with all of that, the semester you take organic chemistry, it's not surprising that when the weed out classes are meant to weed people out, that they're going to be weeding out victims who are struggling with their grades for things that are not their fault, right? And so these are just some examples. There are a lot more that we can talk about across the entire life course. One of the things I think a lot about in my work is that if these consequences have to happen, right now, a lot of people look at survivors and say, just stop caring about it. Just let it go. You're making things worse by bringing it up. If you just wouldn't bring it up, it wouldn't be a problem. Or as Sarah Ahmed writes in some of her work, this quote is so good, I have to say it, to locate a problem is to become the location of the problem. And so people think before the victim came forward, the sexual assault had already occurred and I didn't know about it and it didn't change my life. So I don't think it's the sexual assault that made my life worse. It was the decision for the victim to come forward. Now that's why I feel guilty listening to my favorite artist, right? But if we remember that there are naturally occurring consequences of sexual violence and we think that the just thing to do is to put them on the shoulders of the perpetrator who chose to be violent, as opposed to the victim who did not choose to be a victim, then what you do in the aftermath on a community level is a lot more clear. A lot of people in the aftermath of a sexual assault, they want to support the survivor, they show up and they offer that emotional support, but then they get impatient and they think, why isn't this over yet? And one of the things researchers find is that survivors can never safely share space with their perpetrator again. The trauma is so intense that your body will react. And even if you push through, those reactions are still going to happen. And that's where a lot of those chronic health conditions come from, is being in a state of chronic stress, often through, again, having to share space with your perpetrator. And so in the immediate aftermath, people kind of get it, but then they get frustrated. And so I talk about weddings as an example, because often it's years down the line, somebody who, say everybody went to college together, you haven't seen each other in a long time, you were all in the same friend group, and it came out after college that something happened. But there's this assumption of, isn't the victim over it already? I'm going to invite both people. And someone who thinks that they're going above and beyond will maybe go to the victim and say, if you're not comfortable, I totally understand, you don't have to come. That's putting the consequences on the victim, as opposed to, I think it's a very reasonable thing to say that if you sexually assault someone and you see them in any public space for the rest of your life, it's reasonable that we all expect you to turn around and go somewhere else. And that's something that I think it's a paradigm people are really missing, that you can hold someone accountable in big ways and small ways. And if you're focused on giving something tangible to a survivor, I don't think we have to wrap our head around this idea of is it fair or not? Because if we don't do it, it's unfair to the survivor. And so things like, I don't want to enter, I'm going to make sure this perpetrator isn't in the same place where the victim is forever. I think that's the kind of stuff we need to be doing in our personal lives and in our professional lives, especially when we can't trust anyone else to do it. We can't trust these institutions to do it.
Do you feel like if we make these kind of small changes within our smaller community settings that we'll see on a national level? You spoke a lot about California, and California is a fabulous state in so many ways. They're very liberal, they're very forward thinking in the way they're going about things. But a place like, let's say, Wyoming or, one of the Dakotas, so it's just going to be kind of state to state where people are feeling safe in this way, where then there's other states where they just don't feel like this is something that's acceptable or accepted, I guess.
Yeah, I think it can be contagious in a good way. Once we have safe havens where sexual violence isn't acceptable, where we have a model for what accountability really looks like and what survivor protection and support really looks like. Right now, one of the reasons there's so much resistance is because people act like survivors are being unreasonable. They say, well, there's sexual violence everywhere. It's like this in every industry. If you don't like music, good luck with academia. If you don't like academia, good luck with Hollywood. Good luck with corporate America, right? There's this idea that the violence is ubiquitous, but that's not true. There are places where sexual violence doesn't happen. The research finds that those are the ones where it just isn't tolerated. That where when somebody commits an act of sexual violence, the response is, it's not someone I think is qualified to work here anymore. That sounds like someone who's an issue for our climate. That sounds like somebody who's going to make it difficult for people to collaborate and feel comfortable in the workplace, and we're not going to keep them here. And those spaces can stay pretty safe, actually, over long periods of time. And so I do think that it's contagious because it gives us that imagination. It starts to feel possible. And I also think one of the other reasons that I feel really strongly about this is because when we prioritize perpetrators over survivors, the survivors are the ones who are taking the hit, right? They're the ones who have to switch schools. They're the ones who have to leave the band. They're the ones who are switching industries. And I do think there would be a lot of power in just keeping them, not having those types of disruptions, and having people who are more empathetic to survivors, who understand the stakes of this type of violence, who have that expertise that they have gathered the hard way, and hopefully some the easy way too, reading and listening to other people, stuff like that. Having them in place, I think, creates a much greater likelihood that people will take this stuff more seriously and have a sense of what to do when it happens. It isn't just about the protection of the perpetrators, the loss of the victim too. And I do think that retaining the victim means a lot. There was one person working in the Title IX office who sort of publicly identified as a survivor. And because she was the only one, she couldn't gain a lot of traction. She only worked there for a year, the exact same amount of time I was there, actually. We started and left the same week. And she had come into the Title IX office because she wanted to fix it from the inside. And she had all these common sense ideas, really, really obvious. Some of the stuff is not complicated. Things like people find the Title IX office intimidating, or people know that if you're walking into the Title IX office, they know what it is. And so if you don't want all of your friends who are in the same academic building to be like, why are you going in there? You can't safely go to the space. And so she had the idea of, we can have like a satellite place. Like, we'll come to you and I'll rotate. Every other Monday I'm going to go near Greek Row. Every other Monday I'm going to go towards the theater department or any of these other places. It would be so easy and connect with so many more people. It does work in providing other social services, but it was shut down because there was nobody else to join her in fighting for it. And when I think about what it would be like if, she was pushed out after a year, at that point, there was nobody publicly identifying as a survivor in that office, to my knowledge. So the next person who comes in also doesn't have any allies, also doesn't have any support. How are they supposed to turn the tide? And so being able to just keep a few people in the places they're in would go a long way. And I think when we're talking about violence that involves women, it's worth recognizing too that some of these people are not moving to other jobs. they're disappearing into the private sphere altogether. It's something that I think, especially in more conservative spaces, where some of these more conservative states, and in this sort of hostile, like really messed up political environment we're in right now, where there's this idea that women are supposed to be at home, there are a lot of people that when a woman that they love experiences violence, the thing that they say is like, well, that's what happens when you're in the workplace. That's what happens. You want it, we think about performing arts. You want it to be a star. The attention comes with it. And you know what? Now you're getting kind of old. So can you really start over? Is it better? Maybe you should just have a baby. Maybe you should just support your partner. Or they're always behind in their partner in comparison to their partner's career path that wasn't interrupted. And so we're not even really talking about just keeping victims from being diffuse and not knowing where each other are. In a lot of cases, we're talking about keeping them in the public sphere at all. I think that'd be really powerful.
It's kind of like thinking locally when voting versus, oh, I'm just voting for the president. Stuff changes in your small community, and then it kind of ripples out from there.
Yeah, and one of the things that's true about this kind of stuff is once people get used to these gains, they're hard to claw back. I've been thinking a lot about how sometimes it feels like we're not making any progress, but then you remember, oh, wait, 50 years ago, women couldn't have a bank account. Even with all of the gender regression we're facing right now, there's nobody trying to claw our bank accounts away because it's unthinkable. That could be true here too, that we don't have to fight that hard to keep those gains. One of the ones I see from the Me Too movement, it's disappointing, but the Me Too movement didn't produce a lot of structural change before the backlash really took over, really in the form of the Kavanaugh hearing. And a lot of momentum was lost. But there were still some cultural changes that I still see. I was conducting research with survivors when Me Too went viral. I was halfway through a study. And one of the questions in the study was, have you told anyone what happened to you? And if so, how did they react? And in the first half of the study, it was really common for people to say, I only told one person. They said I was drinking too much. They said, why would I go there? They blamed me in all these different ways. And so I never told anyone else. A lot of people said, well, I had a bad experience disclosing something else. So no, I haven't told anyone. You're the first person I've ever told. And after Me Too went viral, it switched. And all of a sudden, everyone's like, oh, I've told everybody. I put it on my Facebook. I put it on my Twitter. Everyone knows what happened to me. I've gotten so much support. Everybody was so nice about it. I didn't realize I knew so many survivors. We have a little club now. We have a Stitch and Bitch, whatever it might be. I still, in my interviews, even though we've had a lot of regression since then, see that when people are sexually assaulted, they're more likely to recognize it as sexual assault faster instead of blaming themselves and saying, why do I have an issue with it? Why am I suddenly depressed all the time? Why am I having, all of these different trauma symptoms and thinking that maybe there's something medically wrong with them or whatever else might be happening. They're recognizing what it is in the moment a lot more often and a lot faster. They're seeking support a lot faster. And I think that's a hard thing to claw back. Once it's in the culture, once people have the skill set, they're going to use it. And I think that's a nice thing. And so that's another thing that really keeps me feeling optimistic is that we don't have to revolutionize absolutely everything for some of the wins to be just impossible for them to take away. And I still feel that way even with what happened with Roe v. Wade. So
I want to cycle back to something you had mentioned before about the survivors almost being kind of shuffled off in a way and removed from a situation, whether you're in a work setting or a university setting or, some sort of musical or a label type setting in regards to music. We've gotten a number of comments and blowback. People always talk about cancel culture. There's a lot of chatter about anytime you talk about anything and try to shine light on anything, automatically you're trying to cancel everyone in the entire world. When you were explaining what we already know, which is that the current culture almost recommends that these survivors who speak out eventually kind of get shuffled off out of the limelight and go off somewhere and just kind of detach from everyone and everything around them. It's almost like they're canceling them in a way where they're losing their connection. They don't get the Stitch and Bitch. They don't have the survivor and community support.
There's this one case that I talk about as the only one where the perpetrator was expelled. And on its face, if you think about the way like the men's rights movement talked about this case, they would say, this is ruining his life. This is going to change the trajectory of his life forever. Doesn't he deserve the right to an education? All these different things that come up, right? In reality, This was either his second or third expulsion. I heard mixed things. By the time the expulsion paperwork was filed, he had already transferred to another university. He wouldn't have any meaningful educational disruption, not even a semester off. And the university he transferred to was just down the road. He could still live in the same apartment. And that is something that's sort of, again, male privilege, where I don't remember what his major was, but, something like chemistry that almost every university has. So he has his pick of every single school he'd want to go to. Whereas a lot of majors for women, they're not as common. Not every school has a nursing department. Not every school has a dance department. Gender studies, especially in this political climate, gender studies departments are closing all over the country. So the stakes were totally different when someone was removed from campus. And I think that's something that as women, we have to remember too, is that when we empathize with perpetrators, we are bringing our view of oppression to that and thinking, wow, if I couldn't stay in school, then I would have had to transfer 2 states away to be able to stay in my same major. And that's not true for a lot of men. And it's just something that we can't even conceptualize of, because what is the world like, with that kind of privilege? You can't even picture it. But yeah, in his case, he was definitely upset that it was going to slow down his degree by maybe a semester or so. When I interviewed him, he would say things like, this is ruining my life. But ultimately, it seems like it was just delaying it a little bit. And that seems to be what's happening with perpetrators across all industries. A lot of the Me Too men, from, the comedians, the musicians, the news anchors, they're all reappearing. They just took a few years away, right? And that's now the advice that they give to each other, is just wait it out for a couple of years. You'll come back with a renewed fan base who thought it was so unfair you had to step away to begin with. It can be a career advantage for them, and they get all of this support, even though during that time they did nothing, right? It's sort of the opposite of the way we expect the rest of work. But in this particular case, in comparison, the victim, this case dragged on for 2 years. Her perpetrator was so violent. He showed signs of lethality towards her in his abuse. So she actually had to withdraw from school for the whole 2 years that the investigation was going on. So when you look on it on paper and you look at what the two people have experienced, it's just so obvious that she actually experienced the greater disruption, but everybody's so worried about him. So you're right, it is the opposite. And this is actually a conservative tactic to be able to convince us to not care about these injustices that we're witnessing. So something I'm thinking, if you want to read the book, it's very good. Get it from a library. It's like a little expensive. But it's called Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And one of the things he was trying to explain is how racism is so persistent and structural racism is so persistent, but nobody thinks they know anybody who's racist. They think it's disappeared. And a big part of how that happens is the use of these liberal values to convince people to be racist. Things like, we're all liberal here. We care about freedom. We care about equality, and affirmative action is unfair because shouldn't we just treat everybody exactly the same? And this push towards a colorblind racism. It's the same thing across the board, that very often what the conservatives will do is they'll take a value that we hold near and dear to us, tell us that if you care about it, you actually need to care about the perpetrator. The perpetrator is the one who's not getting their due process rights, right? And then we all sort of forget about the victim because we follow them with the rhetoric of what they say that value is, even though if you look at what they're really asking you to do, it doesn't align with that value at all. And so one of the things I think everybody needs to be careful with in the misinformation age in general is when somebody says something and they use a word that you think, wow, that's something I support, that's something I should care about. Try to understand how they're using it. Try to understand what they mean. I talk about this in the academic version of my dissertation, but I had to sort of answer. The Trump administration said a lot of stuff on college campuses around the importance of due process for perpetrators, this liberal value of due process. And I had to answer why I don't address that really in the book. And what I said is that it's not a good faith argument, because the president who said he cared so much about due process is also the one who started his campaign by calling all Mexicans rapists, and some of them are good people. That's not someone who actually cares about the weight of a sexual assault allegation. That's someone who thinks they should only be reserved for non-white people. And those are two very different things. So yeah, they very often are doing the thing that they're accusing us of doing. And that's just the way that goes. Perpetrators do this too as part of their abuse. That's how gaslighting works. A lot of people think of gaslighting as lying now, or that it's deception. That's not what gaslighting is. Gaslighting requires that reversal of victim and offender to lead the victim to stop trusting their own judgment and become more dependent on their perpetrator, to feel like the abuse is their fault and that they need to fix everything. And it is exactly that. It is that reversal that you're talking about.
Are you familiar with Jon Krakauer's book, Missoula?
I am indeed. Yeah.
Okay. It sounds like I've mentioned that on the podcast before. I read it a few years ago, and it sounds like everything that you have studied is a much more scientific deep dive into kind of what's discussed in that book. He brings you on a journey of what happens to these students as they go through the college-based judicial system, I guess, within the universities at the hands of a number of different members of the college's sports teams. But what you're doing, I think, is similar on the surface, but you're going much deeper into kind of the actual studies behind the motivations of and how we're able to hopefully fix in the future. It's great.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with that. I loved Missoula. I actually reviewed it for a psychology journal when I was in grad school.
So off-putting. Every few pages, you just feel sick.
It's really upsetting. And I would say that in comparison to Missoula, I got a deeper look into these cases for myself. So the way that Jon Krakauer wrote that book is he focused on cases that were already in the press. And he used a mix of FOIA requests or Freedom of Information Act requests, since all university emails at a public university are technically public documents. He got a bunch of those to look at for himself. He looked at a lot of newspaper articles. I think he did interview a few people, but sort of selectively based off of who would say they were okay with that. In comparison, what I did is I spent a year inside a Title IX office. I met and interviewed all of the victims, perpetrators, and administrators for myself. And I was able to observe their day-to-day interaction. So instead of seeing what got written on paper, which often paints them in a bit more of a favorable light, I got to see those discrepancies between they wrote this, but this is what actually happened. And so I think that in some ways there's some new betrayals that come out in my book that you wouldn't be able to figure out coming from Jon Krakauer. I think about this really on a theoretical level of what's the kind of stuff where our institutions exert power over us. That yes, I saw it on a college campus, but you'll also see it in a workplace. You'll also see it when talking to your health insurance company. There's a chapter about what happens when universities or any of these institutions hold a monopoly of information about how they handle this stuff. And it makes me always think about my insurance company, where you're calling them and you're saying, you're not handling my case correctly. And they're like, well, we think we are. And I'm like, is there anyone I can talk to who actually wants to pay me what I'm supposed to get from my health insurance? And they're like, no, we don't do that here. Or they point at someone else and they say, you know, actually that person can help you. And that person says, I'm not the right person. You get this runaround because you can't see their internal policies. So I think that's one of the differences of the book. And then the other one is just, I did get a bit of a deeper look. And especially in these cases that don't go to the press. The cases that go to the press, there's at least some public pressure for universities to do better. And unfortunately, when these cases don't go to the press, universities are even more dismissive of survivors. And so that's really what this book is about, is all of those cases that didn't make headlines. And I think for a lot of people, if you read Missoula and said, wow, that's terrible, but, you know, I can't totally relate to that, you'll probably relate to more of the stuff in my book where maybe you tried to report and you were talked out of it, and then you felt sort of guilty and ambivalent about that, or everything just turned out so differently and you blamed yourself. It's a somewhat different story.
Now, I would really like to go into this ruin the man thing, the number one thing that you're known for talking about, because it's very much something that we've been told that we're trying to do. Before we had officially put out an episode, there's someone who had reached out to Rich and asked who myself and the survivor were trying to take down in this episode. Which is interesting because now, years later, the label that they were on did not continue to put out their things, but they just hosted a large festival in which, guess who's headlining? This band with this person on it. We're, accused of perpetuating cancel culture, but trying to remove these people from their titled positions. We're not trying to do that. We're not trying to ruin anyone, but there is a lack of accountability. There is a almost laughing off of when these things make it publicly within the music industry. I mean, you saw it with the Johnny Depp thing. Not quite music, borders on it. He's a terrible guitar player, so we covered it. But but there's so much of that in so many different situations, whether it's a high-profile case, if it's an actor, if it's a musician, or if it's just someone that you know from a university or a work setting. There's almost this dismissive nature, like you've been talking about throughout the entirety of this episode, of the victim has done something. They're putting the pressure on the victim to prove it. They are used as evidence, as you said. But in the meantime, the victim is trying to ruin and take down someone's life. None of the R. Kelly women are millionaires at this point. It's not working like that. Name off every single person who's, accused Bill Cosby. You can't. They're not home names at this point. People don't know them that way. They haven't gotten the accreditation and the, exorbitant amounts of financing that some of these people think they're trying to go after.
Also, the email being sent to me, a fellow man, as if I'm like the safe person to contact about it.
What are these two bitchy women up to now? Let me talk to the white straight dude to see what he has to say about it all.
Kendra and I are a team in this, so it's not like, oh, am I like a spy? Am I going to like give you...
She's off the rails again. Someone must stop her.
Yeah.
It's so wild because that is the framework that people have for why victims come forward. I'm surprised by how intractable it is. This idea that a victim who reports is seeking revenge. And that's sort of propped up by this imaginary of all these victims who didn't report, and that the reason they didn't report is because they could forgive their perpetrator. They were more sort of appropriate Christian feminine women who realize it's not all men, and so they don't feel the need to take down a system or whatever it might be. Right? But that's not actually why victims don't come forward. Victims don't come forward because this system sucks. And because the system, even on its most basic level, what it asks of survivors, even when it works well, is too much for most people to want to pursue or to be able to pursue. And it just doesn't make sense. Sexual violence is an injury. And so a lot of people choose to treat the injury instead of focusing on the perpetrator. But we can't stop thinking about sexual violence as about the perpetrators, the perpetrator being the main character, which is why we believe this vengeful, ruined lives myth. I think one of the strengths, I talked about this a little bit before, but one of the strengths of my book is I actually tested that directly to say, okay, what's happening to these men? Because there was just this widespread assumption that being accused of sexual assault would be stressful. And that no matter the outcome, that it would at least be a bad period of time while they wonder what might happen to them. And that, yes, we recognize these systems don't typically hold anyone accountable, but they do occasionally, and it must be stressful to wonder if that's going to be you. That's not what I found. What I found from interviewing the perpetrators for myself is that they mostly enjoyed the Title IX process. Because, and I said this during Debt Be Heard as well, but one of the things perpetrators want is control over their victim. That's the main thing they're looking for. And after the violence has ended, very often the victim has gotten away. They have successfully been able to resist that ongoing violence and control that the perpetrator wants. And something like the criminal justice system or the Title IX system forces contact between these two people for a long period of time. And so perpetrators said things like sitting in a hearing and watching the victim have to recount the details of what happened to them and seeing how traumatized she was. They described it as fun. They described it as exciting. And they said things like, I wasn't really worried because I knew that there was no way that I was going to be sort of the first person to be really held accountable for this. And they also had people on the inside assuring them the whole way, it's not going to be that bad. You're going to be okay. You know, thinking about the perpetrator who got expelled, part of how he transferred to another university was that the dean of students got on the phone and facilitated that transfer to another university. So it really didn't feel like there were stakes. And so I think the reality of what it feels like to be accused of sexual assault is just so different from what people tend to think. My most generous read on this is that, again, we come from our own perspectives of times that we've done something wrong. And we think about, getting grounded as a kid and, oh, I took a candy bar from the corner store and that was really stressful when my parents found out and they got really upset, whatever it might be. That didn't actually happen to me.
Yeah.
But that's sort of like a good go-to example. I was an incredibly timid kid. But yeah, we think about it from times that we felt shame, that we felt anxiety, and we assume that they share the same traits and the perpetrators are having the same experience. And they're just not. In large part because a lot of these perpetrators are not getting caught the first time. They've committed a lot of violence. They've been protected. One of the things I argue in the book is that, and the reason I care about universities, I'm not particularly invested in universities as a place. The reason I care about universities is because they teach the most privileged and powerful people in our society how to be adults, including how to be above the law, including how to commit sexual assault without detection and while getting all of these benefits. And so when it comes to this idea of ruined lives, I think a lot of us now know we can look at these men who were, quote unquote, Me Too'd or canceled and say, they're all popping back up. None of them were really gone for that long. Here's an example, look, Donald Trump is running for president again, and he's been found liable for sexual assault, right? But I think the thing about my work that really shocked me the most was that it wasn't just they weren't getting canceled, they were getting benefits, and that this narrative of the ruined lives myth is the way everyone justifies giving them all these benefits. That people say, I have to be the one person who will take his side. Everyone is going to cancel him. No one will be there for him. Doesn't he deserve someone in his corner? And everybody's thinking that. And so it's actually really important for someone to be checking on the survivor. And I also want to say, sometimes people come to me from a really well-intentioned place and say that to me, where they say, I know someone who's a perpetrator. Doesn't he need support to get through this? Doesn't he need a friend to help educate him to be better? And I'm just going to be blunt. If he was your friend at the time he was perpetrating, you are not the friend he needs to get through this and to change his behavior. The best predictor of a man's violence is if the other people, specifically men in his life, share a misogynistic ideology. And so actually, the crumbling of that social network is the thing that is most likely to bring about change. And preserving that social network, you're not actually doing him the favor you think you are. And this is true of men. We know that in the research, but we also know that women standing by perpetrators and saying that they need that second chance, that's how we got in this mess to begin with. On college campuses, it's not the perpetrators who've been pushing to rescind all of these rights for survivors. It was their mothers. That's the group who did this. And so actually, yeah, we do need to hold them accountable. We do need to stop worrying about their lives being ruined. And just, think about all the times in your life that you thought if you had this big change, you would never be able to pick yourself up again. You probably did all right. You thought you couldn't live without your partner. They broke up with you and you just made new friends. It creates opportunity and promise. And that's something that I think about a lot, that ending those friendships, not focusing so much on the life being ruined, the life is going to continue and they'll have an opportunity to figure out what that means for themselves.
One of my areas of study is substance abuse, and it's very similar to when people face, kind of to the end of the rope, where they are to the point of it is a make or break situation. You must stop utilizing these substances in this manner, or else you will ultimately overdose or, injure yourself in some severe way. A lot of the times you see the same thing. You see the family holding on and providing them with support consistently. They're giving them money. They're giving them a place to stay. And then when they're able to cut that network off, that's when you see the change really happen. Because otherwise, they're just kind of getting that soft support and they're able to continue through their substance abuse or substance use. People don't make giant changes until giant changes occur around them a lot of the time. They're almost forced into changes. We hate change as human beings. It's not our number one thing. So a lot of the time, we won't change if we can avoid it. And when the rug gets kind of pulled out from under us and you don't have a place to live and you don't have a financial support network, in this case of substance abuse, then you have to figure out how to move forward. And your life isn't ruined. It usually ends up flipping on its head and something else happens and a new path kind of opens up for you. I find them to be very similar in that way.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of parallels where, again, if the person that you've been leaning on, who's been sort of enabling this abuse, if they're no longer there, none of us think that we're that person. None of us think that we're the person who's been enabling, but sometimes we are. And that, yeah, it does open up the possibility to connect with someone who has a different perspective, who can move them in a different direction. Even just things like when we're talking about parents, a lot of mothers in particular will say, of course, I'm not okay with my son perpetrating sexual violence or domestic abuse or whatever it is. He just needs my support in X, Y, and Z way. And they don't think about themselves as someone who's bringing about a toxic sort of violence ideology. But often the gender norms that created the openness to that ideology did come from home. And so there is a benefit to separating, even if on a temporary basis. Sometimes it needs to be permanent, though. I'm not going to, there are lots of people who are estranged from their parents for very good reasons. But even on a temporary basis where everybody can go back to their corners and say, whoa, how did we end up here? Where is my role in this? What can I change to make sure that this isn't happening again? I think that the entire community has some room for some reflection. One of the things I say a lot is perpetrators can't perpetrate without help. And so this idea that they're existing in this vacuum and that nobody is assisting them in, any component of it, including the ideological component, that's not true. This is something that they need assistance with. And you can do a lot by removing that assistance. You can do a lot to make the violence stop.
One thing that I'm kind of interested about, just because of the fact that Kendra and I have been doing this for 3 years now.
Question mark?
Something lost track. It seems like a million years. Throughout our entire journey of doing this, there's things that we've learned, vocabulary changes, how we talk about things. I'm curious, through the course of researching and writing this book, if there was anything that you were like, oh, I know that this is this way, and then through your research you were like, oh wait, no, I was wrong about that. Something had changed your outlook on things at any point.
There is so much. I'd been doing this work for quite a while before I entered the field. I'd worked as a victim advocate. I'd conducted a number of other studies, including one with men about how they seek consent in their sexual encounters, one with queer women who are survivors of sexual assault. And so I really came to the study thinking I wouldn't be super surprised, and I was so wrong. I was really surprised. I think one of the main things for me was there's this assumption that people who work in these roles of the Title IX office, of HR, of the criminal justice system, wherever it might be, that they are good people doing the best they can, and they're just constrained by the system. And the thing I found most shocking was how often that wasn't really true. That even in these roles that we know have a huge impact on people's lives, that we would expect everybody to be there sort of quote unquote for the right reasons and that this is their passion or whatever it might be. No, it's a job. And it's been something I'm still continuing to learn even now that the book is over. So the book is coming out, now. And I decided to look up at the university that I studied, who's still there? Who still works in the Title IX office? Who still works in the victim advocacy office or the data students office? And the answer was almost no one. There was one person who was left in the same role. They'd been promoted, but in a very similar role to the one they'd been in. Everyone else had mostly left the institution altogether. They had moved on to bigger and better things. And I was stunned in my discussions with them how often they were doing things the system did not require of them, where they had the opportunity to do something different and they just didn't take it because either they didn't know enough to feel confident in it or because they didn't want to do more work. I'm just like, a lot of it was really basic, really mundane. And so now, since leaving the field, I'm not doing any research right now. What I did is I opened a consulting company with another sexual violence researcher to try to take some of these like really obvious things that we could be doing, these problems that are supposed to be unsolvable, and give the simple solutions that we found. So her name is Jackie Cruz. Her research is also very good. That's obviously, I think that's why we're working together. But she, in her dissertation, developed this idea of something that I saw too, called orchestrated complexity, where people say, we would all love to end sexual violence, but it's just such a hard problem. There's no easy answers. There's no good solutions. And the way both of us felt during our time in the field is not, oh, these are great people who can't possibly do the right thing because the right thing is impossible. We felt these people are kind of neutral about these issues and they could do better if they wanted to. And actually, some of these solutions are super obvious and easy and would make everyone's lives a whole lot better. And so we've been trying to put those things into practice. If you're listening to this and you work for an organization or, your kid's school or whatever it might be is somewhere that you think would benefit from some of these obvious solutions, please let us know. Even if you don't want to hire us, we love to hear the types of stuff that people are thinking about. But yeah, I think that was the thing that was the most shocking to me, is it's not that complicated. I kind of expected to be really confused looking at some of these cases and to feel torn, and they were all straightforward. And as I'm sort of stream of consciousness answering this question, the other thing I'll say that I talk about a lot in the book that was really shocking to me is there's this idea that there's not evidence in cases of sexual violence and that it's always a he said, she said. There was not a single case like that in this book. There was an abundance of evidence, and that when people say it's a he said, she said, it's not that there isn't any kind of proof or possibility to know what happened. It's more that the evidence that exists is being systematically disregarded because it doesn't give people the story they want, and the story they want is nothing happened. Those, I would say, are the main three things that really blew me away. Is just there aren't as many people fighting the good fight from the inside as you think. The solutions are simple and they could do better if they wanted to. And the example of that being the evidence, that the evidence is really clear and they just don't want to see and hear it. It took me from a paradigm of if we get the right research, we'll be able to do better, into a paradigm of we could do better right now. There's no reason to wait anymore. And that is in some ways a harder problem to solve, but in some ways a much easier problem to solve. So I feel kind of cautiously optimistic by everything that I learned.
I think you're one of the only people we've talked to that's been so optimistic about things changing in a positive way, and those ways being somewhat simple to enact on a larger setting than instead of focusing on the individual and hitting every single individual until they correct the behavior, but changing the systems on a larger scale. It makes so much sense, and it's really intuitive.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really struck by some of these cases. There were a couple that went not great. None of them went great. But there were some cases that went better than others, and they really taught me just how easy it would be to do better by survivors. It's like a really obvious example is we have this idea of a college student as like a teenager who is single and heterosexual. So obviously there can't be any violence in their dorm room. And that is not true. There are graduate students and non-traditional students who are married, living in family student housing and experiencing domestic violence. It's a group I'd never really heard people talk about, but they made up such a significant portion of the Title IX cases the school saw each year. And there was this one survivor who was in an abusive relationship, and he just, there was an empty unit down the hall, and he just wanted to be able to move out so that he could get away from his abuser. And the school kept the unit empty instead. And I think that's part of, people who've read the book so far have said that it is optimistic and enraging. And part of why it's enraging is because the right thing to do is so apparent. This room is sitting empty. There is someone who needs it to be safe. The school, nobody was in that room all year long. So why not allow the student to be in it? And that's how I felt a lot of the time, which was the things that survivors are looking for. They are looking for tangible things. They can't always put it into words themselves. You don't choose to be a survivor. It just happens to you. And so people don't have a lot of experience thinking through, what might I need? This is a lot of change. I have to get to know this new version of myself that I wish wasn't here, and I'd rather be in denial about, especially at the beginning. And so survivors can't always put into words what they need, but the things that they need are consistent across, there are survivors who have needs that no other survivor has ever come up with. We know what they are. We know how to meet them. And yeah, something as simple as some flexibility for a deadline on an academic assignment or a work assignment can go a really big way. I've thought about this from what I've seen on college campuses. I've thought about it in a lot of other settings. Like, one of the things I think about a lot is that if your workplace requires that you leave and enter the building at the same time every day, that is a place where if you are being stalked, your stalker can predictably find you. And if your workplace just allowed you a flexible start and stop time, or allowed you to work remote some of the time, that would make it so much more difficult for a stalker. And that difficulty is part of why stalkers lose interest, is because it's not effective enough. And so again, it's like such a little thing that we're clinging to the way things have always been just because they're the way things have always been. But that's not a very good reason. So we could change a lot if we wanted to.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, Please like and subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, booking agent, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.